Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us, and welcome to today's webinar titled Strategies to Optimize Commercialization of Oncology Treatments for Younger Adults, which will address early onset cancer through strategic trial design, targeted launch indications, and increased trial access to speed up the delivery of impactful treatments. I'm Sydney Otamanchek from the events team at Scientist.com, and I'm happy to be your host for today's event. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's webinar, ICON, for making it all possible. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our speakers for today. First up, we have Mark McCoy, Director of Client Engagement, Global Market Access at ICON. Next up, we'll have Tanya Obradovich, Vice President of Scientific Affairs within Oncology Medical Strategy with ICON. And our third and final speaker will be Wendy Despain, the Global Head of Regulatory Strategy at ICON. Now, without any further delay, I am very pleased to welcome Mark to join me. Hi, Mark. Good morning. Take it away.
Hello, Sydney. Welcome to today's ICON webinar entitled Strategies to Optimize Commercialization of Oncology Treatments for Young Adults. We're so glad that you would take the time today to participate in this webinar, and we hope that you find it informative and valuable. Recent headlines point to higher rates of cancer in young adults. This should not be happening. People's health should be improving over time, not getting worse. As drug developers, what should we do? We will share some information about the negative trends in cancer rates in young adults today. We'll shed some light on how and why cancer is on the rise in young people. And we will offer some ideas about how drug developers could respond. Traditionally, we think of cancer as a disease of the elderly. Increasing cancer is a problem for young people as well today. The rates of many cancers are increasing all across the world. On the vertical axis, you can see the names of different countries. Along the top of the horizontal axis, you can see different types of cancer. And in each column, there is a, down the bottom, there is a -10, which would mean that that rate of cancer is decreasing by 10%, and then 0 for no change. And then on the right-hand side, you have +10, and that would indicate a positive 10% increase. Now, if you look across the board, just globally at all these different kinds of cancer, you can see that there are a lot more data points on the side of that line that is indicating an increasing rate of cancer in that country, in that type of cancer between 2000 and 2012. And this is really a global problem that we're facing. So now to narrow it down a little bit, let's look at US data for colorectal cancer. And you can see that in the 0 to 49-year-old age group, the trends are worse. The incidence is increasing, and the mortality is pretty much a flat line. It's not going down. And both of those trend lines are worse than what you would see for older populations. With the older populations, the incidence seems to be trending downward, and the mortality is also trending downward. So younger patients in the US are doing worse in colorectal cancer in the US in this time period.
And now I will welcome Tanya to continue the presentation from here. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar today and participating in discussion about this very important and timely topic of how to tackle the development and meeting the need for the younger adults who are getting the cancer more frequently than older populations. So we'll start with analysis of the problem. And within that dissection of the problem and looking into what really is happening, there are really 4 elements that are critical to be defined. The first one is who. So really, what is the patient age? What is the age bracket that we are talking about? As we know, the young adulthood is defined and in a different age brackets, but it's also and that obviously defines to whom these cancers are increasing. But within that question of who, immediate follow-up is really, are there any subgroups in terms of race, geography, gender that are more affected than the others? Another element is, of course, obviously what, meaning is this across the board of all the cancers, or it's actually some specific cancers that are increasing in incidence? Why? We're going to discuss some of the hypotheses that have been brought up until now and in context of some cancers, and also how. So how big is the problem? In a sense, what is the sense for the patient population size that we will be facing in the future in some cancers, and specifically for the younger adults? And obviously we will discuss how to tackle this in terms of the drug development and then access. So when we are talking about who and the group, what defines the young adulthood, we know that this is a kind of a stretchy concept and depends on the research publication that was done. It depends also, there is also a cultural element to this definition. And most frequently, probably young adults are defined from the age 15 to 39 years. But it is important when we are talking about the data and when we are talking about specific information to really be clear about that age definition. It is really of large importance that this definition will ultimately trickle down and have a big effect on the regulators as well as the payers ultimately. As you know, the patient population has to be very clear. So from the get-go of the clinical development, it's very useful to investigate the epidemiology and the mechanisms of particular cancer, if we are talking about specific cancer, and define the appropriate age group of the young adults. So in terms of, are there any subgroups that are really driving most of this trend? It is really interesting, and this is a great publication that looked into the incidences from 2010 to 2019. And it really boils down that in women, patients of Asian and Hispanic descent, is really the effect the greatest. And so under the age of 50, because these patient populations are seeing the largest increase. So this information really strengthens what we have seen, especially during the last year, as a really clear message from the FDA that the clinical development has to make sure that the inclusion and diversity are part of the design of the drug development, and that our clinical trials reflect inclusion and diversity in the patient composition of the trial, and really looking into this and focusing on assuring that these patient groups that actually historically are underrepresented in many trials actually are given a proper access to our clinical development is becoming really a paramount moving forward. And considering that the incidences are rising in these patient population, this is obviously a very large medical need, very large patient need, and in certain indications like that are already large, and in cancers that are affecting quite a substantial groups of patients, such as breast and colorectal cancer, this is really a huge patient and medical need. So problem of incidences of cancers rising goes well beyond the US. And you saw some of the information that Mark started with. But, to drill down a little bit more, there has been a lot of research that's been published recently, especially coming from the UK. And one of the startling informations was that percent change in the younger patient population is really very, very much different and much more increasing than for the older patient population. So this is, you can see the percent change of 22%. And even in the younger of 19, it's really startling effect compared to the older population. So what about organ systems? And really, are we talking about specific cancer types? Yes, indeed. We are talking about, very specific organ systems. And you can see that it's really affecting very specific organ systems. So looking into that, it's very obvious that we have to pay attention to specific organs and make sure that our development really meets the need of these cancers that are rising, especially in the breast, endocrine system, female reproductive system, GI system, and urinary system. It is kind of interesting to note that these organ systems are really the ones that are mostly affected by environmental factors, as they are sort of a first, especially in case of the GI system, because obviously all of the composition of the food directly affects this tissue, and urinary system. And that's where we are seeing percent-wise, especially in GI system, the largest increase. So this kind of hints into possibly one of the etiologies behind this trend, although most likely it is a result of the multifactorial situation. So among these factors, I said, obviously pollution, including the diet and compositions of the diet, but there is quite a lot of research done, although many more investigations remain for specifically particular cancer types, to distinguish between major contributions to this increase in incidence. And again, as I said, it's unlikely that it's going to be a one factor, but most likely multiple factors, as well as interaction between factors. But as of now, some of the, besides genetic susceptibility that is could be underlying all of it, these additional factors such as increase in antibiotic use, water additives and pollution, air pollution, obesity, decrease in physical activity, and lifestyle. In general, Western style diet is, we can say that it originated in the West, but it's really now a global style diet. And others that you see listed here. And again, it's very important to put these etiologies in the context of specific cancers, as there could be more prevalent effects of one or the other of these reasons. So as noted, there are trials, and not only don't need, of course, to be inclusive and reflect diversity of the population, but ultimately also they have to happen in geographies where these patients are located. We have to bring the clinical development close to our patient populations. And there is, interestingly, some difference in geography. And I'm going to hand off to Mark to talk a little bit more about effect of geography on the observed changes in incidence of the cancer.
Thank you, Tanya. Risk of cancer death in people under age 50 is related to where one lives. You can see dramatically different rates of death from cancer in Florida counties that are side by side. Look at how many of the high-risk counties that are in red border on these low-risk green-colored counties. These differences could be due to urban versus rural settings, toxins in the water supply, and different ethnic communities. And I think these differences that you see here in a given geography could be very important when you're designing where you're going to hold clinical trials, or if epidemiological work is being done in this area. We also can see how these risks vary geographically in Europe. This map illustrates annual percent change in colorectal cancer by country. And the countries that had the highest rate of increase were Norway, England, Ireland, France, and the northern part of Portugal. The smallest increase took place in Italy. Investigators believe that these increases in colorectal cancer are due to behavioral activities, excess food and drink, lack of exercise, and smoking. How big is the problem of cancer in young adults from a financial point of view? One study concluded that the per person cost of cancer in adolescents and young adults in the US was about $200,000. Most of this cost comes from premature death, which is going to be a much greater cost than you would see in an elderly population for that particular cost. And you can see the premature mortality across the bottom of the graph there. It's by far the largest number. If we add in the burden of disease cost, the per patient cost of cancer in adolescents and young adults jumps up to over $1.3 million per patient. It's important to note that burden of disease is not a financial cost. Nobody writes out a check for burden of disease. Payers that are responsible more often for direct medical costs, they're going to be a lot less motivated by costs such as burden of disease. And the implication is that there needs to be more continued education to call attention to this burden of disease costs for payers.
I'm going to pass it back to Tanya now to continue.
Thank you so much. Well, now we're going to start talking about factors affecting commercialization and some of the solutions. So if we are thinking about what really is critical to be considered, there are practically 6 buckets that really would guide a development and ultimately reaching the patients. So the first one is obviously indication. And within indication, when choosing it, it really is of critical importance to define the reasoning and the size of that patient population, especially to distinguish that distinguishing features from older population of the same disease and in general. So within that, it's really that information about patient's age that we just talked about, and also to see within that range, is that range really capturing all of the patients that truly may benefit from the future treatment? A response. Efficacy in the younger patients, is there our reasoning to believe that the efficacy would be beneficial versus the other age groups? And we'll talk about this and some potential reasoning behind that can be there. Tolerability, and how that compares to older patient population, which obviously can be very advantageous in terms of the drug development from many angles. And we'll tackle that a little bit more. Then regulatory. It is really important to have a regulatory plan and to be clear about how to gain that regulatory approval for this specific patient population and get the agreement from the agency. Ultimately, it is also value proposition, as the whole risk-benefit profile, as well as how this new treatment will fit with the needs of the patient, especially in this younger patient population, is going to be critical, will be critical for across the board for all stakeholders in the health system and pharma development. So what about some distinguishing features and how to approach that question? This is just one example of the rectal cancer. And interestingly, in rectal cancer, the prevalence of signet cell histology is much higher in patients under age of 40 years. And we are not talking about percentages, we are talking about folds of difference. It is intriguing to think whether within this signet cell histology, within these signet cells, actually there is a biomarker which is highly expressed and obviously would be then present, and because of no histology in older patients, could be a potential target for developing a personalized approach. So it is really very intriguing that we are, as we open the era of personalized medicine, we are opening also the doors to tackling various subpopulations and young adults, considering the increase in incidence that is going to happen in the future, as well as a current medical need, offer quite a lot of opportunity for identifying these possibilities. So if I go to the next slide, there is... Okay, so what about the examples to the breast cancer and colorectal cancer? For the breast cancer, we know that it usually presents itself more advanced at the stage of the diagnosis. They have shorter overall survival. These patients are more likely to be triple negative, and MKI67, which is the marker of proliferation, which is very critical in the mitosis, tends to be overexpressed in the younger patient population. So this is another possible opportunity for defining this group. While really we know from the research so far and the community of developers that young women are often underrepresented in randomized trials. So with this increased incidence in this quite large indication, it really results in a large patient need that we need to investigate, both in terms of the actual population definition and possible best treatment approaches. For colorectal cancer, similarly shorter overall survival, more advanced stages of diagnosis, but also rectal and distal location of tumors in the colon. poor differentiation, lymphovascular and perineural invasion. And interestingly, this is just one of the examples in line 1 hypomethylation. This is a long interspersed nucleotide element that is actually correlating with staging. And hypomethylation is something that is much more prevalent in younger adult patients with the colorectal cancer. So plenty of opportunity to think about, how we define and what is the biological milieu for this indication. If we go to the next slide, because I don't see yes, thank you so much. So what about the safety? We know that obviously, the younger adults typically should be much better in dealing with cancer treatments. But really what is behind of it is that the comorbidities are much lower in younger population. And you can see here, again, very nice work that shows comorbidities presence across the ages. And obviously a huge difference between 80 plus, 66 and over to 80 years versus 51 to 65, but especially 35 to 50 years. So with this is really important as the comorbidities by themselves and the cancer supportive care is really important in terms of overall treatment for the younger adults, for how the practitioners approach the treatment with the new drug entities, but in terms also of the drug accesses, the payers are increasingly looking into the costs and cost benefit and issues around the supportive care. So this is another opportunity for the drug development to have really hit the sweet spot between risk and benefit profile, safety risk versus the efficacy benefit in younger population. If we go to the next slide, please. So what about the biomarkers? So I mentioned just examples of the line 1 and MKI67. However, there are some straightforward image-based and clinical measure-based aging biomarkers that obviously are the markers of the aging that can be used obviously in the context also of the years. And they're straightforward in a general sense of, reflecting the general status of the patient. Where the potential really lies is molecular and cellular aging biomarkers. So it is really interesting. Very nice work has been published during the last year or so about comparing over 1,700 patients in young adults versus over 3,000 patients of the older adults in looking into the mutations and DNA changes, not just actually mutations, but rearrangements, amplifications, methylation status. And there is across 14 cancer types. So there is a plethora of potential molecular biomarkers, omic biomarkers that, one can put into context of the particular cancer. Attention, though, should be made that a particular molecular biomarker, can be different or differently distributed in a sense, depending on the cancer. So, for example, P53, which is very well known for the role in cancerogenesis, it's higher in the younger patients with melanoma. However, it's in the opposite direction in the patients with the head and neck cancer. So it's really going to be cancer specific, and And again, across the age spectrum that is chosen, let's say if it's a 15 to 39, the changes within even that spectrum probably need to be looked at in the context of developing the new product and how much the new product can deliver in terms of the efficacy while targeting that biomarker. If we please go to the next slide. Yes, so what about that efficacy that I mentioned? So this is a very nice example of CalGB study 10403 in ALL. And when intensive pediatric regimen was delivered to the young adults, and compared to the historic control in the young adults, it was seen that really there is a huge benefit, quite large difference in 3-year overall survival, median event-free survival, median disease-free survival. And these are really substantial, such a large differences that actually resulted in specific guidelines for, preferred treatment of the young adults. And this really demonstrates to you that, this approach of tailoring specifically particular regimen that may be developed for the different age group can result in new standard for the young adults. If we go please to the next slide. So the point being here that young adults well tolerated this regimen. And unlike the older adults where the safety profile was not favorable and they could not tolerate. And obviously you can see here some of the safety issues that are predominant in the age 45 and over and 55. So we definitely have a specific population that in young adults that is benefiting from the treatment option preferred for this group. And again, looking into all of this is, chemo from the sort of, it's an old-fashioned treatment composition. When we are thinking about the new paradigms in terms of the new drug development, it just showcases the great opportunity that is possibly out there. Another slide, next, please. So what about another example that I found very intriguing? Adding carboplatin to standard neoadjuvant chemo improved outcomes in TNBC only in patients under age 50. You can see here clear difference in benefit in pathological complete response rate and 5-year overall survival. So obviously, part of it is that the younger patients could tolerate the addition of the carboplatin, but this is exactly the point that one needs to bear as we are moving into the era where the future drug development has to take into account existing standards of care, particularly immunotherapies. So combinations with immunotherapies, how they would actually look of particular product that may not actually deliver good risk-benefit profile in older population, but would actually be successful in the younger patient population. And again, in the context of the rising rates, specifically for the breast cancer and a large patient and medical need, this begs the question of, should we consider in the drug development some angles of this?
So with that, I am now going to welcome Wendy to join me. Okay,
Thank you, Sydney. So yes, let's focus on regulatory considerations for the next few minutes. A quicker path to market may be possible for cancer treatments for young adults. Fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review are all possible for a product with the right profile. So, fast track designation facilitates development and expedites review of drugs to treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need. The purpose is to get new drugs to the patients earlier. Filling an unmet need is defined as providing a therapy where none exists or one that may be better than available therapies. Thus, providing superior efficacy data in the young adult age group in clinical studies can support the justification for addressing the unmet need. This can be requested at any time during the development process. When FDA designates a drug to be a fast track, there is important benefits to help speed things along. These are more frequent FDA meetings, more frequent written communication with the FDA, priority review, accelerated approval, and a rolling review where you can submit completed sections of the application for review before all sections are completed. To be considered a breakthrough therapy, a new agent must be shown to treat a serious condition and provide significant improvement over current therapy. Demonstrating that a drug's efficacy in the young adult population is superior to other treatments can allow for a breakthrough therapy designation with its associated expedited approval. To determine whether the improvement of available therapy is substantial depends on both the magnitude of the treatment effect and the importance of the clinical outcome. Proving this superiority in the young adult population will involve including this age group in your earlier clinical studies, such as phase 1b and phase 2. This request should be submitted no later than the end of phase 2 meeting. A drug that receives breakthrough therapy designation is eligible for intensive guidance on the development program from FDA and all fast track designation features. FDA can approve drugs that treat a serious condition and fill an unmet medical need on an accelerated basis based on the effects of a surrogate or an intermediate clinical endpoint. There are certainly several available surrogate endpoints in cancer indications, as shown in this slide. Showing a greater response rate for one of these surrogate markers in a young adult population can provide evidence allowing for accelerated approval. However, an implication of accelerated approval is that if an oncology drug is approved based on a surrogate marker, like a response rate, some payers may discourage use through utilization management policies until clinical benefit is demonstrated and full approval is granted. Note that 26 drugs which received accelerated approval were later withdrawn. So there are several regulatory strategies that a manufacturer with a cancer drug with efficacy in young adults could pursue. Pre-approval options include orphan drug designation, which provides tax credits, exemption from user fees, and additional exclusivity. Orphan designation is granted for rare disease where the incidence rate is less than 200,000 people in the US. In the EU, it is not more than 5 in 10,000 people. A second option is to include young adults as a component of the launch indication, which is the preference. This would involve showing safety and efficacy in young adults in your initial development program. Finally, inclusion of specific statements in the label regarding safety and/or efficacy in young adults, but not as part of the indication, is an option that could allow you to launch with young adult marketing claims. Post-approval options include obtaining real-world evidence of efficacy and safety in young adults after launch and getting FDA approval to add these data into the label. Other post-approval options include conducting studies to get FDA approval for additional indications relating to the young adult population if the product was not approved for that age group initially. Also, label expansion or updates to include specific young adult data can be added post-approval. For example, if you can show that concomitant medications are not needed in younger adults, this can be updated in your label after it has been approved. Thus, having a robust regulatory strategy in place in regards to oncology products for young adults can lead to more commercial success.
Thank you so much. I'm going to now hand it over to Mark to finish us off with the presentation.
All right, thank you, Sydney. A new treatment for cancer in young adults could potentially have a powerful value proposition. Some thoughts that jump out at us are it's a non-Medicare population. This could mean no Medicare price negotiations in your future. First mover potential. Instead of a product being the latest in a series of approved drugs, a new product could be the first for young adults with a given cancer diagnosis. A product could produce many potential life years of improvement for patients. Many, let's say, life years saved could be a big advantage. You have improvement in productivity could be possible since younger patients are going to be of working age, and as opposed to elderly patients who might more commonly be retired. And finally, the product could benefit in the area of very, very high unmet medical need, which we've been talking at length about here today. So from a market access point of view, a strong story could be told. So to wrap up what we've discussed here today, when we've been talking about cancer in young adults, the unmet need is very large and it's also growing. In many ways, cancer in young adults is a different disease. The effects of treatment, both efficacy and safety, can be different. There are several development and regulatory pathways that could be used to take a product forward. And finally, the value proposition of a treatment for cancer in young adult patients could be irresistible to payers and for providers. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending this meeting and for your questions that have been coming across. And we do have some time to think about the Q&A and some of the questions that have come through.
Yes, thank you all for your really fantastic presentations, really eye-opening data and information that you shared today. So let's jump into our first question. Are there any drugs on the market now that are approved for use in young adults?
So yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, the answer is yes. There are some drugs that have been approved by FDA for the young adult population, and they are called, it's called young adults in the label. However, the way it's defined is normally 18 to 24 or 25 years old. So some examples are Zolkuri, which is a treatment of non-small cell lung cancer that's approved in pediatrics 1 year older and in young adults ages 1 to 21. So they call that population young adults in the label, but list it as ages 1 to 21. There is another treatment called Kymriah, which is a CAR T therapy for leukemia, and it is approved for patients and young adults up to 25 years of age. There's also a vaccine called Pembrea, which is for meningococcal disease. It's for young adults and pediatrics 10 to 25 years old. So there are precedent for FDA approving in this population. There's still an opportunity to define what that age range would be, and that would be dependent on your development plan and discussions with the FDA.
Okay, great response. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add. Otherwise, we can move to the next question.
Let's go on.
Okay. Does the FDA recognize young adults as a population for new indications?
Yeah, as I just mentioned, yes, and they are mentioning the term young adults in approved labeling, but there is still some work to do to defining different age group of young adults. And there was a polling question that talked about what that age range might be, and it's certainly a topic that can be addressed with FDA and in your drug development plans.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have another question. What type of cancer do you feel is the biggest problem in young adults?
I can take that one. Considering the incidence rates rise, the magnitude of rise and importance, it's really the breast cancer and colorectal cancer. These are one of the largest tumor indications in general, with the largest number of patients in the US and worldwide, with a medical need in these indications, and therefore, and the incidence, is rising in both, and it's rising globally. So when we are thinking about opportunity and really a medical need to be tackled, it would be in these two indications.
Okay, really appreciate that. Thank you, Tanya. I also wanted to jump back to our polls and see if the three of you wanted to expand a little bit on what we saw from our audience answers. So if we jump to the open polls tab, our first question was, why are cancer rates rising in younger adults? I don't know who would like to take away a bit of a discussion here, but it seemed the top response was environmental toxins, followed by higher rates of obesity.
Yes, and I can tackle that one too. Well, as we mentioned, we're just looking into organ systems where these cancers are having the highest rise. These are organ systems where, the exposure to environmental toxins, either the food or air or water, are really very close to these organ systems. So it's kind of indicative. Another, obviously, I would agree with the audience, is obesity, because we know interaction between the obesity and cancer for a while. And there is much more to come on that topic as we are facing the obesity epidemic, again, global issue. So what is important is to have always patients on the mind. So with this obviously clear trend in increasing incidence, that will be, resulting in a quite challenging future for the young adults, it is really imperative for the research community to dig into the etiology, to include, as I said, genomic milieu of the reasoning, and for the drug developers to find a way of really dealing with this a large medical need, and help, in a sense, the first, the first row of those that are facing this issue, which is the providers that are obviously increasingly seeing young adults at their practices.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Can you give some examples of environmental toxins that are referenced?
Well, we know for asbestos for a long time.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the asbestos story is not done at all. Not even in the US, which is, most advanced country on the planet. So, and it's definitely persisting in many other corners of the world. That comes as a sort of historically probably one of the oldest examples of the persisting issue. But we are dealing with issues of pesticides, use of pesticides, very wide use of pesticides, that is trickling not only to the food, but it's an issue in the water. And so the exposure to pesticides, the lifetime exposure to pesticides across the globe is really dramatically increased over the last decades. As the whole humanity is striving for better and better yields, and we are also dealing with the climate change that is affecting yields, and therefore pressure on pesticides. The climate change not only being in terms of the change patterns of the precipitation, but really change patterns of the parasites that pesticides are there to deal with. So we are looking into really a large problem going on, and since we know that this is a part of epidemiology, and we also see that this problem is not going to go away anytime soon in the future. It will be of interest to see with, the pattern of change in the pesticide use, whether we are seeing the specific cancer, incidences also following, which will definitely, hint of the, part of the major reasoning why this is happening.
Thank you for touching on that. Yeah, I definitely have heard a lot of information about those two specific types of environmental toxins. We did get a question in that asking whether you can expand on why the incidence of breast cancer is increasing so much in young adults, if you have any information to provide on that.
It's listed as one of the reasons is also the obesity. We know that there is a quite high correlation between the obesity and also the breast cancer. So whether this is really also the factor in young adults remains to be seen, but it also is a use of the contraceptive, which is, hormonal based, and, how that affects over the lifetime, the younger patient population. So again, I don't think the single factor, even for any cancer, any single factor can be pinpointed as the reason, but it's most likely the interaction of multitude of factors. What we need to deal with is the need to treat these patients with probably different treatments and to deliver better outcomes, because we have to and we know that they have a higher mortality. We know the outcomes are not good, and we see the increased incidence. So this is obviously something that should be on the mind of entire, as I said, healthcare and drug developing community.
Excellent. We are almost at time, but I'd like to squeeze in one last question. Going back to our second poll, what is the most useful way to categorize young adults for drug development purposes? Is there a so-called best approach to categorizing young people, or would it depend on, the purpose, the drug, the cancer, the specific type of cancer? Can you expand a little bit on that? One of you.
I can also tackle that one. The first step is to define the prevalence, actual prevalence in the chosen age group. Let's say if one looks into 15 to 50. This is just example, but of course, that can be looked, across the board, and do the epidemiological assessment to see the frequency of particular cancer in that age group. Next step would be to try to define biologically in terms of the biomarker, if that biomarker expression is actually following that same age pattern that epidemiology is showing, which will actually strongly indicate correlation. And that would really be the first two steps that can define the following steps in how one can approach in defining the patient population indication and what their drug potential may be. Because, the drug development usually would start in a much larger patient population or multiple cancers, or, targeting a particular biomarker. But if there is a very large indication, very large medical need where that biomarker is actually useful, or maybe even need for some other biomarker, but for the other reasons that developed drug can be very successful in that patient population. Because ultimately, don't forget that the drug needs to pass a certain threshold of efficacy and have a proper balance between the safety and efficacy. And if that ratio and that benefit is really very different in young adults and allows much better chances of success in a young adult patient population that is quite substantial medical need, that may be a very very viable option for the new drug.
Wonderful. Great answers. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed yourself, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and information with us as well as our live audience.
Yes, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you everybody for attending and spending time with us today.
In closing, we hope you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by ICON, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.